Hi, I'm Chef Jennifer Cabillos, and today we're going to be making Petit Glace. So we're going to start off with a Frangipane cake that we made in another video. We're going to be layering it with apricot jam, rolling a thin layer of marzipan on top, and then dipping it in what's called poured or confectionery fondant. And then finally doing a really fine chocolate filigree on top. So we're going to start by getting our Frangipane out of our mold. There's a paper underneath, a parchment paper. I just want to loosen that paper before trying to turn it out so I don't damage the cake while I'm unmolding it. So I can use that paper to gently pull this cake out. Set that to the side. And I want to be able to remove this paper from the back of my cake. So I'm going to flip it over and then just pull this right off the back. Trying to keep my station as clean as possible. So now I'm going to measure this and I'm going to cut it immediately in half because I want 2 layers of cake for this. It's 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So 8 inches is going to be right in half. I want to make sure that I mark from both sides to be sure that this is going to be a nice level even cut all the way across. Then I can line up my ruler and just use that as a flat edge to cut right across. And this will be my 2 layers of cake. So I'm going to move this onto a clean sheet of parchment. This is going to make it easier for me to move and wrap my cake once it's filled. And I only want a really thin layer of jam on my cake. Too much of it, and when you try to dip it, it's just going to slide right off. So I have some apricot baker's jam. I just want to mix that up really well to make sure it's going to be smooth. There's not going to be any chunks in there. And this cake, we're serving in very small pieces because it's very rich. So a large piece of this would probably be a little bit more than would be desirable. So we want, you know, we have a sweet cake, we have a sweet filling, we have a sweet topping. We don't want to go too heavy on any of these kind of sugary items. We want everything to be well balanced. So I want, almost like I'm doing a crumb coat, just a very, very thin layer of jam. I'm going all the way to the edges. And you can use any flavor of jam you'd like for this, or you could substitute for ganache or buttercream. But you still don't want a particularly thick layer, regardless of what you're filling with. This is supposed to be something very small, delicate, sweet bite. Don't want it to be overwhelming. So now that my jam has completely coated my cake, I'm gonna top it. And once you add this, you have a little bit of wiggle room in case it's not perfectly centered to really line everything up. And I really want to make sure that I'm making an effort to push this flat. And then I'm gonna be kind of even all the way around. Just like an aperture, I'm gonna go around and trim the edges so I don't have to be particularly worried about them being perfect, but I also don't want to be wasting a lot of cake. So now I want to do one more coat of apricot jam, and this is gonna be even thinner than the last one. We just want enough to help our marzipan stick to the top of our cake. I'm pressing really, really thin. I just don't want any dry pieces of cake. So this does 2 things. It seals the moisture into the cake, It also fills any little holes, bubbles, imperfections I might have in my cake and creates a really smooth, slightly sticky surface so I can get really nice, perfect coverage. Make sure you get all the way into the corners. And there we go. So while I'm preparing my marzipan, I'm gonna go ahead and put this into the refrigerator and chill it for 5 to 10 minutes. That way the jam gets really solid and this isn't gonna slide around or move while I'm working with it. So now I can start by preparing my marzipan. Marzipan is a product made from almonds and a super saturated sugar syrup that's really finely processed, and it has almost the consistency of a rolled fondant. So I first need to start by kneading this to get it nice and soft and smooth. This is about 8 ounces. It's probably more than what I'll need. And I'm gonna roll this to the size of my cake, which is about, since I started with the half sheet and I cut that in half, I'm now at the size of a quarter sheet, which is about 8 by 12 inches. But you just wanna knead this until it starts to feel pliable. The warmth from your hands is really gonna help that out. And I like to roll this right on top of a silpat, because if you're trying to roll it on parchment, it'll stick and lift the parchment and it won't be completely smooth. And this also provides a nice stick-free surface so that it's really easy to lift and move onto your cake and it doesn't get stuck to the table or anything like that. So this is starting to get a little bit softer. Before I start rolling it, I want to go ahead and shape it into a rectangle. If I start rolling it in just a big blob, it's going to be hard for me to roll it into the correct shape. I want to start in the shape that I want to finish in. So I'm just going to use the table to give myself almost like a rectangle. I can start pressing that out to make sure that it's going to be consistent width, and then just come back and kind of tighten up those edges. So now I'm ready to start rolling. I'm just going to be using a fondant rolling pin, going back and forth. And I really want that 8 by 12 size. So I want to be continually lifting and moving this around so that it doesn't really stick to the table. I can keep checking to make sure that it's still really movable. And I'm trying to go to about 1/8 of an inch. And when I see I have larger pieces here and not in the corner, I can actually use my rolling pin to redistribute that just by rolling it out this way. I'm trying to make sure I'm maintaining that rectangular shape this whole time. Give myself some corners. Anywhere I see that have a little gap or a hole, I can just roll towards that direction. So I'm not quite there yet, but let's go ahead and check our width. So we're almost 8 inches wide. We're about 10 inches long. So we're getting closer. Flip that over. And now I'm going to switch to a slightly larger rolling pin. Go all the way to the edges here. It's 11.5, which means that we're going to have to turn our marzipan this way so it doesn't come off the edge of that sheet. This should be almost thin enough that you can slightly start to see through it. We don't want this to be really thick layer. It's just adding a flat surface for our glaze to sit on top of and contributing to that nice almond flavor. So we can check again. We're right at 12, but we want to make sure that you can see here that it's not quite 12, that it's tapering in the corners, and that we're not quite at 8 here, although we might be in the center. So I have to make sure that I'm really moving this to be a full rectangular piece with really even measurements. Usually your center ends up being a little bit mounded, so I like to do that pressure right in the center and try and pull that excess from the center out to the corners. All right, now I can check one more time. 8 inches, a little over 8 inches. I have 12 here. So a little bit larger is actually good, and we can just remove that excess afterwards. So I have a nice size piece here. I want to run my hand across the top and see if I can feel any areas that might be much higher than the rest. And then I can just use my palm to kind of redistribute. You could also use a fondant smoother for this if you have one available. Push that in a little bit. It's a little thin right here. Okay, and actually one of the easiest ways to get this onto our cake is to lift this all together and just invert it right onto the cake and then pull the silpat off. That way I don't have to worry about trying to roll this up or lift it with my hands. So now I can go get my cake and we'll get started covering it. Cake back from the refrigerator, and I'm gonna go ahead and add my fondant. I'm just gonna invert it really quickly onto the top, making sure that all the corners are covered. Slide. And then I can just pull this right off the edge. If you can slightly see the cake through here, that's okay. I'm gonna go from one side to the other, just making sure there's no air bubbles underneath, just like you were covering a cake with fondant. I'm not worried about covering the sides. And now I can take my knife and just remove the cake. Remove the excess marzipan. You can probably find a use for that, but it's most likely going to have crumbs in it. So try not to use too much more than you actually need. And if this isn't perfectly flush, it's okay. You're going to end up trimming these entire edges. So this is really just to help you be able to cut and measure properly. So now we have a nice flat, even surface to work with. We're going to start cutting our pieces. Generally, petit fours are 1 bite size. So they're 1 inch to 1.25 inches. I like to do mine about 1.25 inches. Because it gives me a little more room to pipe on top. So just like with my operator, I'm going to start by trimming just 2 edges. One short side and one long side. Just really, I don't want to take a whole lot off. I just want to make a nice, flat, straight edge. And I can actually see that I might have cut this slightly at an angle going inwards, so I just want to make sure that this is completely, my clean angle is a 90-degree angle. Otherwise, it'll throw all my measurements off and I'll have little diamonds instead of little squares. So now I can begin marking my measurements. I want to start from my clean edge, so measuring from here. And I'm just gonna mark 1.25 inches. All the way across. And then I can flip my board around and do the other side. Make sure that you're not measuring from this side like you were before, that you're measuring from the clean cut side. Okay, now I can use my large serrated knife just to make a little mark. I'm not going to cut through yet. I like to mark my cake. Just that way I can see my nice squares before cutting to verify that I haven't made any measuring mistakes. And if I've made any mistakes, I can try and smooth the marzipan back out and then re-measure and remark. So I'm just lining up those cuts with my knife and then drawing it across to make sure it marks all the way across. But I'm not pressing down at all. So now I'm going to go my other direction. I'm going to measure from my clean side towards my uncut side. And still doing 1.25 inches. Now I can spin it around again. And once again, always measuring from the clean side over. I don't want to start on this side. I want to start on my clean side. Oops. Okay. And now I can do the same thing, and I can mark this all the way across. All right, so I should now be able to see really nice, perfect squares, and I'll have two sides with scrap, so I can go ahead and remove that scrap. Remember, when you're cutting, you want to make sure that your knife is straight up and down and that it's not tilted to this side or this side, which is going to make your cake go in or out, and it'll make it very difficult to glaze and far less visually appealing. So I'm going to push down and then slide across, making sure I'm doing full pressure all the way down. This is why I moved this onto a cutting board, so I don't have to cut on parchment paper or sheet tray or anything else. Now we'll do the same thing, making sure that our knife is straight up and down. We're just going to saw, push down, and then pull all the way through with pressure. And then just remove that excess. And you should be able to see nice even layers of cake and nice even layers of jam and a really consistent layer of marzipan. So now I can continue on cutting all my squares. Just like with my operator, I want to make sure I'm cleaning my knife each time on just a nice clean damp towel. So I'll line my knife up, make sure it's completely straight. I'm going to give it a little wiggle to get through the marzipan, push all the way down, and then just with pressure, pull all the way through. Cleaning my knife and repeating those steps. Push straight down, pull all the way through. And you can see I'm using my thumb to kind of hold that cake in place so that it doesn't slide towards me. And cutting squares Seems like a really simple thing, but it's really attention to detail that are gonna give you nice squares. If you don't have detail at each step, then they're not gonna look nice and perfect, they're gonna look sloppy. And when you have something super simple, like this, with not a lot of extra things to cover any mistakes you're making, attention to detail is even more important. So saw through, push down, and then slide the knife through. So you can see that these pulled away. Before cutting in the other direction, I want to make sure that these are nice and perfectly lined up so that all those marks that I made line back up before coming through again. You can slide them back together. And now I'm going to do the same thing in the other direction, making sure my knife is straight up and down. I'm going to give that a little jiggle, push through, and slide. And you can see these will want to move and shift, so you got to keep making sure that you've straightened them back up each time. And sometimes it helps to move these slightly out of the way. That way I can easily readjust to make sure that I'm cutting nice straight lines as I go across. Now this cake actually can be held like this and saved. If you're gonna save it and cut and finish it later, I recommend not cutting your squares because then you're just creating more areas for it to dry out. Wrap it really tightly in plastic. And then either freeze or refrigerate it depending on how long you want to hold them. But once they're glazed, it's a lot more difficult to store them over a long period of time. Now you should have really nice even squares cut all the way across. And we are ready to prepare our fondant for dipping. So you probably want to put a nice piece of plastic wrap that's tucked all the way around the sides and refrigerate this while you prepare your fondant so it's not sitting out at room temperature and drying out. It's also going to be much easier to dip when the jam is cold and kind of adhering everything together really tightly so that the layers don't try to slide apart. So here we have our poured fondant. As you can see, it's very, very thick. This is essentially just sugar that has been very carefully crystallized to create super fine crystals into a paste. And if this is left at room temperature, it will harden into a nice glaze that is creamy on the inside, but has a nice solid exterior on the outside. But right now it's too thick to really dip anything into. So we're gonna need to warm this up. I'm gonna go ahead and turn on my water. And I wanna bring this to a simmer. And I can drop my bowl right on top. So you can see here that I'm at about 78 degrees. I want to take this to about 95 but not over 100. So first I'm gonna warm it, then I'm gonna check the consistency, and I can adjust the consistency by adding simple syrup, any kind of syrup or sugar-based item, which I can also use to flavor this. I don't really want to add just water because it will start to dissolve my sugar crystals and stay really sticky on the outside of my petit fours instead of making a nice crust. So I'm going to be using vanilla simple syrup. That's just a 1-to-1 ratio of sugar and water and has a little bit of vanilla extract, but you could use a lot of other flavorings in here. This can also be flavored with chocolate. There's a lot of really nice floral syrups. You could use maple syrup or honey as well. So now that we're about 95 degrees, I'm going to look at the consistency of this and see how it's draining off my spoon. I want this to create a really thin layer on here that's only about 1 millimeter thick. You can see that this is very thick. So I'm going to add some of my vanilla simple syrup, which I've just put in a squeeze bottle. Only as little as a time, because this will thin it down pretty quickly. So I can check it again and see how it's looking. It's getting much better. I should be able to slightly see the spoon through it, but I'm not quite there. I want to put just a little bit more. If I try and pour or dip my items while that's too thick, then it's going to have a really thick sugar crust on the exterior, and we'll have lots of air bubbles in the glaze, making it not very pretty. Getting closer. We're not quite there yet, so we'll put just a little bit more. And then we can go ahead and test our cake. Show you the method for dipping first, and then I'll show you the method for pouring. So I'm going to take my cake and put it upside down in my glaze, pushing just until the cake hits the bottom. I don't need to push it all the way under. And then I'm going to flip it and move it onto my sheet tray. And I can continue doing this with all of my cakes. Now the benefit of doing this is that I get complete cake coverage on my entire cake. The drawback of doing this is that oftentimes I can get crumbs in my glaze, which will show up on my final product. So push all the way flush. And then I'm just going to flip it over and move it to my sheet tray. Now that I've shown you a few of these, I'm going to show you how to do the pouring method. But I do want you to be able to see the glaze on the sides of my cake. It's just thick enough to cover the sides of the cake. and you can slightly see the layers, but it's not completely clear and it's not very thick. Also, I don't have a lot of bubbling up on top, which means that I have a really nice consistency. I want to continue to allow those to drain while they set. We'll do a couple poured and then we'll come back to these. Now we're going to be pouring our petit fours. I have a nice little pour spout jug that have my glaze in at the right consistency, and I have these evenly spaced out on a rack. Now this method is going to use a lot more glaze and it's going to be a little more difficult to completely cover the cakes, but I won't ever have any crumbs inside. So I'm just going to pour this immediately over the cake, running it, making sure that I'm going around in a circle and really paying close attention to the corners to make sure I get complete coverage of the corners of my cake. Now, if your sides aren't cut perfectly straight up and down, you might have a little bit of trouble getting the glaze to coat the sides and not just to fall off the edge. You can see that it takes a lot more glaze to cover this way, but I should get really nice, smooth, clean finish with sharp corners. You can see that I've missed a corner over here. I can try and very gently go back over it. If you want to be able to reuse the glaze that's panned off of this, you'll need to push it through a really fine chinois fine to make sure that you're getting out any crumbs before trying to reuse it. And make sure that you're looking all the way around. I have some back corners that aren't wanting to coat completely. And then before I'm finished, I would just want to go back around and make sure that I've gotten every single piece of cake. If these aren't completely covered, then it allows air in, which will make your cake dry out. So we really want to seal these all the way around. The corners are the most difficult part. Now that they're completely covered, I'm going to allow them some time to set. We'll start to see this shine slightly dull. It should still be shiny, but it won't look quite as wet, and that's when we know we're able to move them from here into either a platter or into paper cups for individual service. So now you can see my set petit fours. These are the ones that were poured, and these are the ones that were dipped. There's two different ways. If I'm plating them for a buffet, I probably want to put them directly, if I'm plating them for an amenity, or for a tea, I might want to put them directly on a plate. If they're going on a buffet, I probably want to put them in a paper so they can easily be picked up by one person. So I have these little paper cups. I'm just going to flatten them out. And I want to be really delicate when I'm moving these. This is just a dipping fork that I'm grabbing underneath. I can put it on my paper and then grab the cake with the paper and just fold those edges up and stick them to the cake. And that way I can push these really close together like this. Just make sure you're being really gentle and delicate during this process. I'm gonna make sure I go into the very center of that paper so all the sides are even. And I'll pretty much use the same process for moving these onto a plate. Except for instead of being able to push them off on the paper, I'm going to use a small spatula, tilt it, and be able to lift my fork out from underneath. Once these are down, you're not going to want to move them. They'll smear and leave sticky spots all over your plate. So you want to make sure that they're well spaced to begin with. You should have really nice, clean looking pedophores on both of these. So now that we have them plated, we're ready to put a little bit of decor on here. So we're going to add a chocolate filigree right to the top of these. Now I can decorate these with a small chocolate filigree. Make sure that the tip of your bag is very small, as it's going to be difficult to do this delicately with a larger tip. There's a demo of how to do these particular filigrees in another video. Remember to lift your bag and let the chocolate fall straight from the bag. Try and make sure that your size and spacing is consistent on each pedophore. If for any reason the chocolate gets too cool in your bag and starts to seize up, make sure to stop piping and fix your bag rather than squeezing harder, as this can cause a blowout on top of your pedophore and ruin it. What we want is for each one of these to be as perfectly consistent as possible. I can feel the chocolate starting to get thick inside the tip, so I can just gently pinch it, warming it with my fingers and squeezing out any chocolate that's too thick before continuing on. Now I'll switch to another design. Notice that I'm holding my bag straight up and down. I'm touching it with one finger in order to anchor my movement to prevent my hand from becoming shaky. I'm also looking at the shape of the square to inform where to put each layer so that they're all consistent. And now I have my final petit-fours.